now talk about some of the activity today. If I can have the next slide. Okay, so this is the series that we have. Panel 1 is today, September 23rd, and we're really going to get into what green infrastructure is and how various parties are working on green industry and how they're approaching it. We encourage everybody to join the other 2 sessions. I think it would be really good to connect all of the dots here with regard to collaboration and coordination with communities. I think that's real key to being successful. And then really, how do we integrate all of the efforts of all of the different parties, including agency efforts and other stakeholder efforts. So we look forward to your involvement in each of these. If I can have the next slide. So for today's agenda, we've got the schedule of panel presentations, Q&A. We'll have a break, and then there will be poster presentations. While we were not able to have the event today, originally we were going to have it at the Autry Museum of the West, and they've been a really good partner of ours. We weren't able to do that. That was what we originally planned, but we do plan to come back to that facility in the future because we think it's a really great location, but also it's a really good educational opportunity there. And we would have also preferred to meet in person. So we're looking forward to getting back to doing that. But please, if you have an opportunity, visit the Autry website or in person when they're open and learn more about the region's first people. I mean, they are the ones that were really the stewards of this area for both the water and the land in our region and the intersection of natural and cultural history. So I encourage you to learn more about that, that history. I think it's a good opportunity there. And in addition to understanding the responsibility that we have to be the stewards of the land and the water and the watersheds, it's also a responsibility to work with disadvantaged communities to make sure that we have the ability to move our goals forward in an equitable way, and we continue to take on that challenge and try to solve those issues. So at the council, we've worked with a number of community-based organizations. We've worked with municipalities, school districts, and others. And I think what we are about is trying to bring parties together and share information and share solutions. And I think that the program today, along with the other 2 segments, will be a good way to bring things together. And if I could have the next slide. So for putting on the program today and in the next couple of sessions, I really would like to thank our sponsors and our partners. They've been tremendous in this last several months as we've planned for the online version of what was originally going to be the in-person. I would like to thank the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the Los Angeles Sanitation and Environment Agency, the LA County Public Works, Jacobs, Scott's Miracle Grow Foundation, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and all of our other sponsoring organizations and companies who have genuinely supported the series of events that we are putting on. The council has partnered and collaborated with many sponsors and partners on green infrastructure projects, and their support is critical. And over the years, it reflects a commitment by all of them to move forward with the mission that we really embrace. I can have the next slide. So I think as we start the conversation today, it's helpful to know kind of where green infrastructure has its definition and try to maybe, there's various ways that people interpret green infrastructure, but to start to have a common understanding in some ways. And the definition of the Clean Water Act has influenced the council's work, but the green infrastructure definition and efforts and projects and such are growing. I mean, it's not a static thing. As we learn more, we're learning more about how to approach green infrastructure, and green infrastructure provides benefits to a variety of communities and other needs. And I think it's real key that we pursue this in a way that mimics natural processes. It's grown beyond just open spaces and green belts. Maybe that's where we were a number of years ago, but now it includes how that gets integrated into our neighborhoods with stormwater, with urban forests, parks and transportation hubs and corridors. So as you drive around and you look at particularly public places, but more and more commercial areas and even private residences, you can see the effect of that. Next slide. So the Council for Watershed Health will be next year celebrating its 25-year anniversary, and that's important to us and important to all of the stakeholders that have worked with us, because 25 years ago, next year, Dorothy Green, our founder, formed the Council to create an organization to bring parties together, and that's what we have tried to live up to. We look to bring agencies and industries and public entities together, stakeholders, to have a goal of sustainably managing our stormwater and our water supplies while conserving, protecting, and restoring our ocean and beaches, rivers, and streams. So it's with that mission that we convene green infrastructure experts, including you and our audience. And for this symposium, we want to learn kind of where everybody is and where we're going with green infrastructure. So we're really excited about this. The picture that you see in my background is the success of doing a project that, when I first started with the Council, we were developing a water supply augmentation study with a number of different partners, and that helped steer the way towards actually putting something in the ground at Elmer Street and Sun Valley. And so that's a huge success that we continue to try to demonstrate in other areas. So with that, I'd like to introduce Eileen Alduenda, who is the executive director for the Council. And she and her staff have put a lot of planning into this. And she's going to take it from here and talk about where we go with the program. So Eileen.
Thank you, Steve. And good morning, everyone. And I wish I could see everyone, but I know you're there. And as Steve mentioned, the picture here on the slide is of Elmer Avenue. I'm hoping many of you have had a chance to visit Elmer Avenue in the past and hopefully in the future. And I wanted to just kind of point out that it's with Elmer Avenue that we really started to understand the multiple benefits of green infrastructure. And there's many layers here. What I would like to kind of point out that in terms of our monitoring of Elmer Avenue, we monitored for a number of different things, but we really started with the water. And we learned that the water quality improved, that more volume of water can be captured using green infrastructure on a number of different scales. In wet years, we were averaging 11 acre-feet at Elmer Avenue. We've monitored for community awareness of watershed-related issues, and we know that those have increased over time. And we've also monitored and gotten a better understanding of the operations and maintenance requirements of green infrastructure, especially at Elmer Avenue. It changes over time because it's a living system in many ways, and we expect that to change, and we're looking at ways of adapting and kind of using those lessons learned to inform the design of future projects, which I know many of you have incorporated into your own processes. So we continue to monitor the other benefits of Elmer Avenue as well, such as habitat and how the project is being used. Sometimes it's used in unexpected ways, in both good ways and bad. We know that there are some interesting real estate trends that happen with green infrastructure. And we know that there are other things to monitor. So we use Elmer Avenue as sort of a jumping off point. It remains a good demonstration of what can happen when we bring multiple perspectives together and bring in multidisciplinary teams. Next slide, please. There we go. And so with Elmer Avenue, it was a multidisciplinary team. It had multiple funders, we brought in multiple perspectives, skills, and expertise to inform that process. And I'm sure many of you in the room today contributed that expertise and have continued to learn from that. Our presenters today represent a variety of entities in the fields of research, policy, and practice. And it's always nice to see who's in the room along with us. And so Today, we know that we've got representation from nonprofits, from landscape architecture firms, from environmental consulting firms and engineering firms, academia, and a number of different local government and state and federal agencies. And I'm sure there's more that aren't represented on this slide at this point in time. And just as important as to who is in the room is who isn't in the room and who needs to be in the room when we talk about green infrastructure and we start to plan and implement and design. And these are important questions that we need to, to continue to ask as we look at the future of green infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Because we're finding that the benefits of green infrastructure are also priorities for entities that traditionally don't focus on water-related issues. In our work, at least with our work, we found that in the non-water world, community-based organizations, in the non-water world, community-based organizations, we found that their priorities and their project goals for increasing recreation or reducing urban heat island or improving active transportation and even enhancing sort of the ecology or habitat in their communities can be achieved with green infrastructure projects. And because these benefits matter to all of us, and they all, it reflects a value, it reflects the values that we all share for healthy watersheds and healthy communities, it's important to understand how we can measure these benefits and what these benefits are and how we can measure them. Next slide, please. And so having the benefits and having the tools, the indices, the frameworks is what we've asked our panelists today to share with us to help us better understand what we can expect from green infrastructure projects, how we can use those benefits to help inform decision making as we look at designing and planning and engaging communities and implementing and even the maintenance related to green infrastructure. So throughout the day, we'll be gathering various tools. We'll make these available as part of an online toolbox as part of the symposium proceedings. And as I get ready to introduce our first panelist, I'd like to invite you to contribute. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yep. Contribute to this toolbox by sharing what tools I'm sorry, can you go back to there you go. The tools that we'll be sharing, what tools you're using for green infrastructure planning, design, implementation, maintenance, and community engagement. And you can contribute that by texting or replying online. And if you can check the chat for the details, we have a poll that will be collecting all of those resources. And then we'll be sharing those after our panel presentations. All right, so now let's get into our panels. Next slide. Actually, can you go back just for a second, Claire Sophia? Is the poll ready and active?
It will be, so I'll put the instructions in the chat and then everyone will be able to, while the panel discussion is going on, reply.
Thank you. I was expecting a different slide there. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have a number of presentations, very short and to the point. You'll note on our program that one of our presenters has been moved to panel 2. We're hoping that that works out. There was a last minute schedule change that needed to happen. And so we're eager to get this discussion started. As I said, we've challenged them to use a few slides to present their key takeaways for their work that's related to green infrastructure. They'll each present for 5 minutes, and after they've all presented, we'll pose your questions as well as other questions that we've received during registration. And then I just want to remind you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions as we go forward with the presentations. And we're going to start off with Ureli Sanchez, our own senior scientist who's been leading our monitoring of green infrastructure projects. And we're eager to learn about the results from a recent survey related to green infrastructure and the practitioners. So Ureli, you're up.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm excited to set the stage for our discussions that we'll be having here in a minute. And so I'm going to be reviewing the results of a recent survey. Sorry, if you can put the next slide up, please. Of a recent survey and interviews that we conducted with green infrastructure practitioners and experts across the state, but largely focused in Southern California. And so we did this work for the Trust for Public Land, and the work was supported by the City of Southgate and the Rivers and Mountains Conservancy. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Orchard demonstration project, we did this work for the Urban Orchard project, and that project is going to transform an empty lot sort of nestled along the river into an urban orchard, a park space, and there's some green infrastructure and habitat features. And so the work was motivated by Urban Orchard, by better understanding the multi-benefits of projects like Urban Orchard, and was an effort to get lessons learned and learn from project practitioners that were implementing these kinds of projects. Next slide, please. And so, again, we implemented surveys with practitioners across the state, and we asked them questions like, what determines the goals of your projects and what data do you collect? And so here I'm presenting sort of the top 4 or 5 results that we got from experts across the state. And so as you look at the chart on your left here, at the table on your left, you'll see that the majority of folks, that the goals of their projects are driven by regulatory requirements and the goals of municipalities. We also see that granting agency goals and community input and local plans are important in determining the goals of their projects. And so when we ask them what kind of data do you collect, you sort of see that alignment between their goals and the kinds of data that they're collecting before a project is implemented. So we see stormwater is really important. Water quality and capture is some of the data that the majority of practitioners are collecting, as well as community priorities and habitat. And so that definitely lines up with what we would expect based on the determinants, the primary drivers of projects. But what was interesting is some of the data that they're collecting after. So we see a little bit of a drop off in terms of how important that water quality and water capture data is. So it went from 87% of project practitioners to 48% that are collecting data after project implementation. And then we see some shifts in the priorities. And so operations and maintenance and education become more important after project implementation, but still it's just only 48% and 35% of practitioners that are collecting that kind of data. And I have a word cloud in the center there. And so the size of some of those words is how frequently those responses were in terms of the kinds of data folks are collecting. And so you'll see that a lot of it is blue because it's water quality and capture focused. And the most popular response was, folks are collecting data about pollutants and bacteria concentrations and volume captured. Next slide, please. And so then we asked, what are the benefits that your projects provide? And so we got a whole diversity of benefits, and I'm only showing you the top 5 here. And so again, water quality and captures is up near the top, but one of the surprising results is that the majority of respondents believe there are educational benefits to the projects that they implement. And then we have some things like flooding, shade, and habitat that were also some of the top responses that we got from project practitioners. Next slides, please. And so if you remember the response to the survey in terms of the kind of data practitioners are collecting, it's, the benefits don't necessarily line up with the kind of data that is being collected. Next slide, please. Oh, we're missing a slide here. So maybe I'll just sort of summarize what we found. So in large part, we found that practitioners are not collecting the kind of data to support the existence or provisioning of the project benefits that they identify. And so some of that might be because there's a good literature base and sort of they assume some of the benefits are there based on what they're finding in the literature. So that might be the example for water quality and water capture where there's a little bit more data and certainly for shade. But when we followed up with practitioner interviews and asked, well, why aren't you collecting the kind of data that sort of aligns with the benefits that you believe are there in your project? They largely said it's because of lack of funding. And the folks that are collecting data about project benefits are doing so with sort of innovative partnerships with academia, are doing it with funding that has less constraints, like funding from foundations, and are donating staff time to do some of this work. And so I'll leave you with some of the wisdom of the project practitioners that we interviewed. And they said, we need to quantify benefits, not just qualify. And they acknowledge that practitioners are sometimes operating in silos, and that a lot of the research that is there that can better inform project design and project placement already exists. So we need to take a moment to sort of, dig in and do a little bit of research before we start project implementation and design. And take a breath and if you are going to monitor, think about the knowledge that you will be adding through your monitoring. Is it new data that could contribute to what green infrastructure projects look like and the benefits that they derive?
I think we're good. Thank you, Ureli. So we're learning more about what data is out there, what data is being used, what needs to be, what gaps exist. And we know that we're interested in expanding on our research and are interested in others that might be sharing that interest and interested in collaborating. And let us know. And there's a lot of opportunity to leverage our existing work, not just ours, but everybody else here in the panel and in the room. And we're trying to figure out ways that we can kind of recreate that network that often happens when we're in person, kind of inside the Zoom world, I suppose. So we're continuing to look at ways of doing that, and we'll be kind of adding that to our website panel page. So look for those opportunities. One of the key things that Ureli has shared, though, is the silos again keep coming up, and ways of looking at how to reduce those silos is going to be an ongoing challenge, perhaps, in many ways. I think we've made a lot of progress in that way. But one way we can start to kind of continue to keep those silos at bay, or start to break down silos that are new to some, is to look at different approaches of approaching green infrastructure projects. And certainly different frameworks and indices can help with that. And we have Dr. Sarah Dieringer with the Pacific Institute with us today to share some lessons learned on their multi-benefit framework. So Sarah, why don't you share with us what you've learned about this multi-benefit approach?
Great. Thank you, Eileen. Yeah, and thank you all for being here. I think this is such a great panel, and I appreciate how we're sort of moving first into what is the challenge and what is it that people need in order to put better projects in the ground. Do you want to go to the next slide? So the way that this started for us was that we were looking at the cost benefit of stormwater capture throughout California. And we were looking at 50 different projects that were proposed primarily for water supply options through proposition funding. And what we noticed was that first, that there's a large opportunity for stormwater capture in the state. We estimate somewhere between 6 and 10% of urban water usage can be offset by stormwater capture. But that also, there are all of these other benefits that come from stormwater capture projects, particularly green infrastructure projects, that aren't always being taken into account in the way that we consider the cost benefit of these projects. And that really limits how many of these projects actually go into the ground because we don't value them as much as they should be valued. And so what I'm showing here on this slide is from some recent work that looked at those 50 projects throughout California and looked at the different benefits in a monetary way that were provided for each project. And you see that many of them have those large water supply benefits, but that a lot of them also, a large portion, if not all of the project actually is valued as habitat benefit or flood control or water quality benefit. But one of the challenges we were having looking at all of this was that not all of the benefits were considered for all of these different projects. So for example, some of the projects may have only looked at 1 or 2 benefits while others looked at more. And when they looked at how to actually quantify or monetize the benefits, it wasn't a consistent method. And so it made it really hard to actually look from project to project at how valuable these projects really are and compare or prioritize which projects are likely to be the most cost effective. Next slide, please. So this led us into thinking about what is a better approach to thinking about multiple benefits. And so what we put together was a framework that we're calling a multi-benefit approach as a way of guiding through a process of thinking through multiple benefits in a more systematic way. And this approach is really meant to be very flexible and modular. For example, if some folks are really interested in thinking about benefits more broadly for a project, identifying those benefits or the trade-offs, we've tried to provide some resources for that. But then also for folks who are really interested in, okay, how do you monetize this particular benefit? And we wanted to make sure that those kinds of tools are available in the toolbox. And so the approach essentially has 4 steps. The first is around envisioning the project or program and really thinking about what are the goals of what you're trying to do. And thinking more broadly. We often go into particularly water supply projects thinking about what's the best way to get to water supply, but that may or may not be actually all of the project options that are available if you think more holistically about all of the different benefits. The second is around identifying the benefits and trade-offs of the project options that you've identified. And really importantly in this step, we've thought about how we need to first identify the benefits without worrying about which ones we can quantify or not quantify. And that way we're not ignoring important benefits that may be more challenging to quantify, but really trying to put that at the same level playing field as all of these other benefits. The third step is around then characterizing those benefits, trying to put metrics on there that we can really measure or model and understand. And then the last is around informing decision-making and making sure that these analyses and this way of thinking actually makes it to those who make the decisions in a way that makes sense to them and speaks to them. And one of the things we found from interviewing a lot of people who do this kind of work was the importance of stakeholder engagement as part of this process. That identifying benefits really relies on also understanding the beneficiaries and understanding what are the benefits that are important to people in the places that these projects are going. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd show a quick example of putting this into action. This is an example of a project we worked on in Austin, Texas, where they have a really interesting rainwater capture rebate program. And the idea of the program is to stack different rebates on top of each other based on the multiple benefits. And so we started with, there was an existing rebate for water infiltration and a stormwater rebate that came from Austin Water as well as the Watershed Protection Department. Next. There was then an added rebate provided by urban forestry for new trees, which looked at particularly the benefit of new trees in urban spaces. Next. And then finally, we were able to look at what are all of the multiple benefits of this program and then identify additional benefits and partners that might be interested in stacking their rebates or funding essentially this project that can provide benefits toward their own goals. So for example, we were able to model the impact of this program on urban heat island effects and translate that into reduced energy use for air conditioning as a way of bringing in both the Office of Sustainability as well as the Austin Energy, who are interested in these types of benefits. Next. So what I've tried to show here is that there's multiple benefits of looking at multiple benefits, that there's a lot of outcomes beyond just being able to provide these different multi-benefit projects. The first, going back to the stormwater example, is that looking at multiple benefits can really provide a more objective basis for comparing different water management options, really going apples to apples at looking at different projects and the benefits they provide. And this really leads us to be able to optimize how we invest our time, money, and resources into water management. But it also provides an opportunity to share costs among the beneficiaries and identify those opportunities to bring in additional partners. Looking at multiple benefits can also help build community support for projects or programs. I think especially for stormwater managers, it's a challenge that stormwater may not be the sexiest topic for every community, but there are multiple benefits of green infrastructure in particular that communities are interested in. And so looking at all of those different benefits and communicating that to stakeholders provides a new opportunity to build that community support. And then the last and perhaps the most important piece of this is that looking at multiple benefits allows us to increase the equitable investments of water. We tend to look just at benefits, but there are also certainly trade-offs of our water choices, and looking at both the benefits and the trade-offs can help us to mitigate some of those adverse impacts of projects and programs. Next. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sophie.
I'm going to interject here just for a second. Thank you, Sarah. It's really always good to see a good, a case study of how a framework has been applied, and we know that there's more coming from this. So we look forward to learning more about how the application is informing the project processes along the way. And it's really interesting that these other benefits that are coming out of the framework are ones that we can look to help inform the decision-making processes going forward. I want to just thank everybody for bearing with us as we work through some technical difficulties. We've had folks join late, and so I just want to pause and just remind folks that we are recording the panels. All the panels will be recorded, and so if you've missed something, you can always, we'll make it available for folks to go back and see what they've missed, as well as the chat. We are hoping to be used for the technical difficulties people might be having with microphones or video. And then if you can use the Q&A button down below to post any questions that you'd like to have us ask of the panelists. And we've got staff monitoring those, and we'll be gathering those and bringing those into our discussion. And I think with that, we are good to move to Sophie. We've learned a lot from our panelists as we prepared for this, and it feels in some ways like we're kind of funneling down, kind of going from the large to the kind of a narrower scale. And this is where the work of Dr. Sophie Parker is most relevant in terms of how we're looking at the different solutions that can help inform where we place projects. How do we look at the multiple benefits across a number of scales, and how we can get to that. So I'm going to pass it to Sophie at this point, and we'll see what we can learn about the tool that the Nature Conservancy has been developing and using.
Great, thanks Eileen. Hi everybody. Thank you. I'm here to talk about the Nature Conservancy's project Planting Stormwater Solutions. I am a lead scientist at the Conservancy, and I'm part of a larger team of folks who's working on this issue. You can advance the slide, please. So what we're focused on is nature-based solutions that are vegetated. And those are the ones shown here in the green outline. So they include things like bioretention basins that have vegetation, green roofs, constructed stormwater wetlands, bioswales, places where you can use soils and vegetation in order to capture, slow, store, and filter stormwater. We recognize that there are other solutions for doing this that don't necessarily incorporate vegetation, but we're focused on these nature-based solutions with our work. And the analysis that I'm going to talk about today focuses on how we can maximize benefits through the siting or the placement of these nature-based solutions. In particular, we've done 3 different analyses, one related to water quality, one related to social and public health, and one related to biodiversity and habitat. Because this group is probably, many people here are probably very familiar with water quality. The ones that I'm going to focus more on today are the social and public health benefit and the biodiversity and habitat benefit. And how our analyses address each of those. Next slide, please. So first, just thinking about social and public health indicators, what we did is focused on the study area that's the urbanized portions of greater Los Angeles, south of the San Gabriel Mountains. And we looked at 6 different indicators of public health and of the social condition. So these include absence of plant cover, air pollution burden, urban heat, population density, percent people of color, and economic hardship. And for each of those, we worked with experts at Prevention Institute and USC who are used to thinking about these social and public health indicators and developed metrics to rank these census tracts across the Los Angeles basin in terms of how they rank. And then by combining all 6 of the indicators together, you can get an average ranking for each census tract. And so here on the map, you can see that the average ranking, where the average rank is high, you can see those are in the dark blue, and where the average rank is low, those are in yellow. And so what you can start to see is if you want to provide benefits that alleviate some of the public health challenges that we have across greater Los Angeles, you might want to focus in these places that provide the greatest benefit. Next slide. The next slide relates to biodiversity and habitat indicators. And the way that we did this work was, first, we were working at a finer scale because the data are available at a finer scale. So in this case, we're looking at the census block scale. And on the left, you have this little black square. What this is meant to depict is, imagine that you're looking from space at a satellite, using satellite imagery of a city block, and you're going to code the different land cover types based on what you can see. Trees and shrubs would be dark green, grass is in light green, roads and buildings are in black, bare soil is in brown, and the gray category is other paved. So if you're looking and you're trying to code this landscape and understand where there is an opportunity for putting in a new stormwater project, a nature-based solution that uses vegetation, in our analysis, we assume that trees and shrubs and grass are already serving as habitat. And we also assume that roads and buildings are going to be very difficult to convert into habitat. So we assume that the opportunity space here is represented by the bare soil and other paved, so the brown or gray areas. And we took that information and looked across the region and found that if you look at census blocks and you look at the proportion of each block that's available that has that opportunity space, you get this image. And what's interesting about this is that there are some places like San Pedro and the harbors where there's a lot of opportunity space because there's a lot of paved area within each census block. But there are also some places that are very, very small blocks that have opportunity as well. You can see along some of the Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers, places near LAX, in the Rio Hondo area, and all across the region. And so what this is meant to show is that there is opportunity to do this type of work, both at the large and the small scale across the entire Los Angeles region. If you take our analyses and you stack them on top of each other, so you layer biodiversity and habitat indicators on top of the social and public health metrics, on top of water quality benefit, you can start to get some prioritization of where placement might be most beneficial. I'll stop there, and I think next it goes to Moss.
Am I on?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. I was going to provide a nice little kind of segue from Sophie. I think Sophie's kind of set the stage for you, Moss, in terms of kind of looking at the region and where those indicators indicating where there's some opportunity. And she's kind of so nicely provided this example of biodiversity, which we've been talking about as a way of looking at where those opportunities are for green infrastructure as well as other opportunities. So I'm going to pass it to you, and you're going to take us through the efforts of the City of LA and the Biodiversity Index, and you're going to introduce Isaac Brown afterwards to kind of keep a clean transition between the two of your presentations. So thank you.
Perfect. I'm just going to give you a quick background and timeline on the biodiversity program that LA SAN is overseeing. In May of 2017, the City Council unanimously approved the biodiversity motion that put LA SAN in charge of this program. And really the objective of this biodiversity program is to maintain and enhance biodiversity within the city of Los Angeles. So what we did was we compiled a group of experts that we called the Expert Council in 2018. And then we met at the end of August of 2018, and we actually measured the biodiversity within the city boundaries using the Singapore Index. That was the biodiversity index that was available at the time. During that time, when we were trying to calculate the indices and the metrics of the Singapore Index, the expert council members came to the conclusion that some of the data for the indicators were difficult to get. And two, some of the indicators weren't really that well suited for the city of LA. So what we did was we compiled a list of recommendations on how to design a customized LA biodiversity index. And we then produced a draft 2020 biodiversity report that consists of a proposed LA specific biodiversity index, as well as something that we call the ecotopes framework. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The status of the 2020 biodiversity report is that we sent that draft to over 60 members of the expert council. And we ended up getting back about, well, over 200 review comments that we're in the process of addressing right now. We're about 50% of the way through all those review comments. The goal that I set for both Michelle Barton and Dr. Isaac Brown is that we finalize the report by the end of October. This means that the goal is to get the finalized 2020 biodiversity report on our LA SAN website by early November, and then extend it to the printers for hard copy publication sometime around early November as well. Next slide, please. Just to give you a little taste of what the LA specific biodiversity index looks like, this is the table. It consists of 3 themes: the native species protection and enhancement, social considerations of biodiversity, and governance and management of biodiversity. What you'll note here is that it is not just looking at the numbers of plant and animal species within the city of LA. That's just a small fraction of this index. We do not concentrate on this. This is more of a comprehensive overarching index, and it has 8 indicators: habitat quality, indicator species, threats to native biodiversity, access to biodiversity, education, community action, as well as governance and management. So it incorporates all aspects of the biodiversity index, so it's really multifaceted. Next slide, please. One of the, a really good example of why we didn't think the Singapore Index was that good for the city of LA can be exemplified by these 2 graphics. If we take indicator 1 of the Singapore Index, which is percent natural areas, when we calculate that for the city of LA, we get 20.6% natural areas within our city boundaries. The Singapore index measurement is that if we get that much, we actually get the maximum score of 4 out of a possible 4 points. But if you take a look at the right graphic, the ecotope or ecological subregions of the city of LA, you'll see that a lot of that percentage of natural area is driven or influenced by the Santa Monica Mountains, the Santa Susana Mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains that kind of rim the city. But if you take a look at the various ecotopes or ecological subregions that we develop, you take a look at all the gray areas there, San Fernando Valley, the area around Santa Monica, LA Airport, downtown LA, Boyle Heights, South LA, Elysian Valley, and the Wilmington area. Those are all areas or ecotopes that have less than 1% natural areas. So this is much more informative. The ecotope framework is much more informative and helps us with decision making. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share with you LA Sand's perspective on our biodiversity program. Our director and general manager, Enrique Zaldivar, considers the biodiversity program a common thread that weaves throughout all of LA Sand's environmental programs. For example, citywide, including disadvantaged communities, our clean water program really works hard to keep our water bodies, for example, the LA River, Santa Monica Bay, LA Harbor clean. And that has a direct, clean water obviously has a direct bearing on maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. Just like the clean water program, the solid resource program is more citywide, and it conserves resources, solid resources, and helps to eliminate waste, for example, plastic waste. And obviously that helps maintain and enhance biodiversity. We have a number of programs, and I'm just giving you 4 examples here, the 4 bullets that are focused specifically on environmental justice communities. We have a real strong focus on disadvantaged communities. And the watershed protection program, as you know, and as some of the speakers before me talked about, multi-benefit stormwater projects. And those stormwater projects are focused and targeted toward the disadvantaged communities. They really work a lot in the DAC communities. The tree planting program and the grants that we get, these multi-million dollar grants that we get from CAL FIRE, are specifically focused on disadvantaged communities. The Healthy Soils program that we're just going to go ahead and start. And in fact, there was a press event with Councilman Paul Koretz and our director and general manager today from 9 to 10. And hopefully it'll be covered by some news media of a Healthy Soils motion that's going to be brought forward to the city council. And there is a documentary titled Kiss the Ground that's going to be aired on Netflix. So please go ahead and look for that and view it. It's a great program, a documentary. I've actually already previewed it, and it's really, really good. And then lastly is a brownfields remediation program that is pretty much focused just on environmental communities, environmental justice communities. So not only is the common thread biodiversity through all our environmental programs, but you could actually have the perspective that environmental justice is as well. So that concludes my presentation. And as everyone knows, a plan is only as good as its implementation, and metrics are only good if they have something to measure. And so I would like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Isaac Brown, who will talk about 3 different implementation projects, and will be very informative. Isaac, you're on.
All right, thanks, Mas. As Mas said, the index is really it provides a citywide measurement of biodiversity, and that's so critical for a coordinated, integrated strategy and leveraging multi-benefits through our policies in big scale. But how do we take all that information and get it into the, people's hands so they can make change in projects on the ground, because that's how the needle on the index is going to move, is what happens in the future at the project scale. So the way we're doing that is really organized around this ecotopes framework. The 24 ecological subregions that we've delineated for LA and neighboring areas that are related to LA ecologically. We know ecology doesn't stop at city boundaries. So these units are really a lot like watersheds. They're driven by landforms and soils, vegetation types, and also microclimates. Importantly, microclimates. LA is an incredibly diverse place ecologically, and really microclimates are I'd say maybe the strongest driver of that. We've got 5,000 feet of elevation change in the city alone. So these ecotopes, what we will be providing with the ecotopes is a database of layers, including things like landforms, soils, slopes, aspects, hydrology, microclimates, and a lot of the indicator results from the index. Things on the right, you can see a project that's being done by LA SAN and the Watershed Protection Division at MacArthur Park Lake. And we've got on the far right the urban habitat quality, which is one of the biodiversity index indicators, and urban habitat connectivity. The results, so that as people design these projects, they can help determine what the best ecological approach is. And sometimes it may be a biodiversity priority or a water quality priority, but we want to get this comprehensive data into people's hands and make it useful at multiple scales. You can see on the bottom right, we're providing this kind of scale hierarchical approach where we look at subregions, neighborhoods, and down to the site scale. So this is a really key, I think, tool that will help standardize the way people look at their project sites across the city. I think that's, the challenge of, other speakers have talked about it, of everybody's kind of got different metrics and different priorities, and the city is in a position where they can really take a leadership role to kind of try to organize and standardize this stuff so that we really can see where we're going citywide, but also make sure that all the projects are achieving certain standards that we've set. So next slide. This is another project being led by Bureau of Engineering down at Taylor Yard along the LA River. And so another kind of key this is really a next step of the index, is the index is really citywide, like we said, but how can we take a lot of those indicators down to the site scale and use them to evaluate how well a project is performing, or use them in the case of Taylor Yard. We use these indicators to evaluate the differences between 3 design alternatives. People familiar with the project may be familiar with the islands concept, the soft edge concept, and the yards concept. And so we took, and this slide is showing the 4 native biodiversity indicators that we were looking at. It doesn't have any of the social or governance indicators, but we looked at habitat quality of the different plans, the types of habitat included, whether they are oriented around target species like arroyo chub or some of the rarer species, threatened and endangered species. The edge effects, so is the project, what is the program of the project, and how does that affect species? So edge effects are things like light pollution or even runoff or noise that affect biodiversity. And then finally, on the very bottom, the offsite connectivity. Is the project designed in a way that it allows species to move through the project? And in this case, movement along the river upstream and downstream was a priority, but also this kind of transect connectivity approach. Are we providing connectivity from top to bottom watershed? And in this case, it was, does this project site connect to the Rio de Los Angeles State Park next door? and all the way up to Mount Washington and Debs Park further to the east. And so, this is, these kinds of tools I think are really key for comparing project alternatives. And ultimately, if we have a standardized index, projects like this, especially these big projects that really move the needle on the citywide index, if they have a way to report back how well they're doing, I can envision a scenario in the future where we have, maybe through the planning department, all the projects in the city are feeding in metrics so that we can make sure that we're on track for hitting these big environmental targets. So that's kind of a future, I'd say, goal, I think, for the city is really how do we, use this index in a really sophisticated way to shape change and at this project scale. And then the next slide. And so the third topic, I guess, take home I'd like to leave is that, and just I guess reiterating the importance of that statement that Enrique Zaldivar made and Mas relayed, that biodiversity is really, it's kind of an umbrella indicator. If you have biodiversity, you're doing a lot of things right for the environment. And so these are four what we're calling umbrella species that we like, and we're looking at how can we, and the index tracks umbrella species and how they're doing, but I think these offer a lot of really big opportunities for shaping the city. So for example, the Southern California steelhead or even the arroyo chub, if we have these species in our rivers, that means we have pretty good water quality. We have connected watersheds from ocean to mountains. We have, and that provides multiple, that's an indicator of multiple benefits. That means we're doing something right with stormwater. We're providing probably a lot better connectivity for recreation. And we're probably providing a river that, has a lot of aesthetic appeal compared to what it has now. So that's a good one. The mountain lion, obvious for big scale connectivity and big scale parks. If we have mountain lions in our big wilderness and they're connected, that means we are really kind of providing a regional framework that supports biodiversity over the long term. So these big species are really, really indicators of large scale landscape sustainability. I really like the El Segundo blue butterfly that lives out in the dune, sandy soil kind of ecosystems where we have dune buckwheat out by the airport in LAX and Santa Monica. This is one, if we have this species, that means we have dune buckwheat. And if we have dune buckwheat, that means we have sandy soils. And if we have sandy soils, that means we have permeable soils. And if we have permeable soils, we have groundwater recharge and stormwater benefits. So the more we see this species, I think the better we're doing, especially in these ecotopes, this dune ecotope that can sustain them. And this is a species, if people planted this thing in their yard, planted the dune buckwheat in their yard, this species could come back. And the thing about the first three species is these are all threatened and endangered species. So these are species that are headed toward extinction in a lot of cases because of cities. So I think this is I hope the future of cities is that we stop contributing toward extinction and start contributing toward recovery. And I think we got a lot of potential for that with indices. And then the final species on the right, that's not a rare species, California scrub jay. But that's a species that is real common to a lot of folks who live up in the hills and the edges of the city. But if you live in South LA, if you live in my neighborhood down toward gateway cities, you never see this bird. And so this is, we need to think about, these kind of more urban areas and how indicator species can be used to, see how they're doing. And the scrub jay, if we have scrub jays, that means we have a lot of good tree canopy, probably native tree canopy. They love oaks or native shrubs. So this is, and it's got to be connected with large open space. So, the more we see the distribution of this species in the city expand, that means we're doing the right thing for biodiversity. So with that, I'll pass it to the next presenter.
I'm going to jump in here just for a moment again. Thank you, Isaac and Moss. This biodiversity index and the fact that it really provides us with a thread to kind of see how things are connected. It kind of moves across all scales, and I think it's going to be another really valuable tool kind of planning for future projects, and in particular around these species of both flora and fauna, to make sure that we've got the habitat that's needed to support them. In my way of introducing Darla Ellswick, we've been looking at this from a couple of different ways, and the municipalities are sometimes challenged with you know, kind of thinking about species, but I think Darla can kind of bring us, can provide a perspective in terms of how municipalities have been thinking about these other benefits. So I'll go ahead and pass it to you, Darla, and we'll come back and do questions and answers around these, because I know there's a lot of questions around the biodiversity and how that can start to inform our planning and processes for green infrastructure projects. So welcome, Darla, and you're up.
Thank you, Eileen. If I could have that first slide there. So as Eileen mentioned, I was asked to speak about stormwater management really in that municipal context and how that nexus with green infrastructure. And I think to do that, I wanted to provide a little bit of context in how we currently see green infrastructure implemented in our urban landscape predominantly. And it's those 4 ovals you see there to your left. So in our urban landscape, green infrastructure, we see it implemented through local landscape ordinances as part of new and redevelopment on commercial, residential, et cetera, type of land uses. We also see green infrastructure implemented through stormwater quality control regulations, predominantly through the Stormwater National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permits, their requirements for controls on post-construction requirements for new and redevelopment. And then we also see implementation of green infrastructure, what I've lumped as voluntary retrofits, meaning all things coming forward in terms of grants and special taxes, loans, etc. This would include efforts by government agencies as well as nonprofits and other groups, things like Measure W, Propositions 1 and 68. And then we see green infrastructure implemented as part of capital improvement programs, sort of what Moss was speaking to. And this is usually as part of stormwater, flood control types of programs that you see with a county or a city, or let's say a flood control agency. Predominantly, it varies by location, but I would say that predominantly green infrastructure that we're seeing currently implemented on maybe a per square footage basis is really in the realm of requirements that come with new and redevelopment. So these landscape ordinances and these stormwater control ordinances. And I was really intrigued by the earlier speakers about areas of overlap of where we should be thinking about putting our green infrastructure for benefits. And it always seems like Murphy's Law that they don't tend to coincide with where redevelopment is necessarily happening and those regulations, but that's for part of the discussion we'll be having. In terms of really thinking about stormwater management, so, you know, landscape ordinances are not stormwater management per se, directed stormwater management, but of course, any kinds of these impervious areas, trees and things that are put in as part of landscaping and soils is helping stormwater. But in terms of really thinking about directed stormwater management, we're in these realms of the regulations, the voluntary retrofits, and the capital improvement programs. And of course, as we're hearing from other speakers, we can get a myriad of benefits in how we manage our landscape. And in the world of stormwater capture and use, we can get these environmental, social, and economic benefits. Historically, we managed stormwater as a waste product rather than a resource, and that made sense. You know, over 100 years ago, stormwater and the way that it was managed when there were still horses on the streets, it was a threat to public health. Stormwater was a threat to public safety and public property. So we became very efficient at getting rid of that stormwater, usually to a receiving water body. And it's only now that we're starting to have a more hindsight perspective in terms of the different kinds of benefits that we can achieve when we manage stormwater to achieve these myriad of benefits, including our progress towards watershed health. And in that, I mean both ecological as well as the human ecology that comes with watershed health. And as we're hearing, we have these benefits, but we need to identify what are those benefits that we get. And we're hearing previous speakers talk about some of those benefits that are there for community and wildlife and et cetera. And then we have to assign some sort of a value. We have to understand, what's the currency that those metrics are worth, so to speak. And I was happy to hear previous speaker Isaac talking about target conditions, because our knowledge of metrics and health stands flat if we don't know what it is that we're trying to achieve. What does it apply toward in terms of our target conditions in order to achieve watershed health? So this framework is really thinking about how we look at green infrastructure in that urban context, in that perspective of stormwater management. And now I want to hone in really on the grant world, because I think it's indicative of how we're starting to look at stormwater management in terms of multiple benefits. So next slide, please. So the council and myself worked on Proposition 1 with State Water Resources Control Board as part of their the $200 million that was allocated out of this, I think, $7.5 billion of bond funds for Proposition 1, and $200 million of that was directed to stormwater management. And in these applications for Prop 1, and maybe those on the panel and those in the audience were part of applying for Proposition 1 stormwater funds, it was required that you submitted quantitative information of benefits as well as qualitative information of benefits. So I thought that we would share some of this just to give some of that insight in what it is that we're all having to do now. It's a very good thing, what we're all having to do and starting to think about our stormwater projects in terms of multiple benefits. The image to the left, the table on the left, that is a template directly from the Proposition 1 Stormwater Control Board application process. So this isn't something that we created. And in this, if you can read that, you'll see that you were required to put in at least a primary and a secondary benefit. And you were supposed to quantify that. And you needed to quantify that in terms of an average annual benefit. And then you could put in a secondary benefit, a secondary benefit, and quantify that if you wanted to. So that was required. Additionally, you were required to give a full description of how did you come up with that metric? What were your data sources? What methodology did you use to identify these benefits? And that entailed making sure that you were looking at data sources that were credible and methodologies that were credible and made sense. In our processes, and this is just an example from one application, if you had additional benefits that you had quantified and you wanted to look at, you put it in the text description. And the table on the right shows a number of climate adaptation benefits as well as community benefits that we calculated for this particular project. So in doing, this is the new world. This is how Prop 68, Prop 1, Measure W, a lot of the efforts going forward are going to require that we quantify information. And therefore we have the tools in order to get to those metrics and those quantified values. So in the work with the council, we used a variety of tools. We used everything from iTree to the California Air Quality Resources Board, climate tools. We used stormwater management models. We used the International Stormwater Database, BMP database, amongst others. And as part of my understanding the proceedings post this event, we're going to make all those resources available to you, all the links, including, I find it very helpful to go back into all the applications that people put in when we're awarded in Prop 1. So you can see some of the data sources and ways that people looked at compiling their benefits. We also had to go through a process. So it's not enough just to have the metrics. You need project-specific information. You need to know about that site or sites that you're evaluating. You might need geotechnical information like the percolation of the soils in the area. You need to know your BMP sizing and the capacity for stormwater of those systems. And so you need your methodology applied to those metrics in order to come out with the specific benefits of your project. And often what we'll see is a use of what I would say a proxy for a real benefit. So for example, in the chart to the right, you'll see community trail path there down in the table 2 of 1.4 miles. We're doing our best to provide quantified value. So we say we've got 1.4 miles of the community trail that is part of this project that we're proposing. But what we probably really want to know is things like that 1.4 miles, how much benefit does it give in terms of community health, or the psychological or well-being aspect of being on 1.4 miles of a nature-based trail. Those are really more the kinds of benefits or metrics that we would like. But for now, we do our best and we put in 1.4 miles of community trail and path and try to describe in the application that these are the qualitative benefits that we think come with that. So we've got a ways to go in that realm of quantifying those benefits. But then what, in these applications that we're starting to see, what is the next step? And that's the next slide, please. And so continuing with the same example from the Prop 1 State Water Resources Control Board application, you were required to now do an economic analysis. And in this economic analysis, you start looking at those benefits in terms of that economic comparison or that economic valuation. And in this example, again, this is the State Water Resources Control Board. Their focus is on water quality. So the big circled oval there in red, you'll see that these quantified metrics of benefit acre feet per year are in volumes of stormwater that are captured or treated or infiltrated or used. That's the primary targets, their primary emphasis of the water board. And you get a value in that top table over the life cycle or the expected life cycle of those BMP elements that are there. In this example, bioretention, infiltration galleries, and permeable surfaces. You get a total volume over the useful life of that project. Again, trying to bring benefits in a way that we can start comparing alternatives. That value is then taken into what's called a net present value exercise, which we are again increasingly starting to see in how we value and compare alternatives and benefits. And again, in this example, the value of the total volume managed over that life cycle is then incorporated with the cost of that project, whole life cycle cost, including the O&M cost over the life cycle of that project. And it's turned into a net present value, meaning what's that value of that project in net present value economic terms. And this one, it's about $6,700. This is a pretty simplified approach. It does not allow for a more robust analysis, like you're hearing from some of the previous speakers, a triple bottom line of all the environmental, social, and economic indicators. But it does get us back to some degree silos versus more comprehensive analyses. So with the siloed approach, water quality, we get more robust, different funding sources, and different kinds of values and benefits that we can provide. We're able to do a more robust analysis and bring stakeholders to the table, as Sarah was saying, I believe, or maybe, yes, Sarah was saying, around stakeholders coming to the table to discuss what are the best decisions in making for project alternatives that we see, and that highest value project that we can see. So I believe I will conclude with that to let Eileen start the question and answer period around this topics that we've heard today.
I'm really slow unmuting myself today. Thank you, Darla. It's always great to have your perspective in on these conversations. And I really do appreciate all of our presenters' perspectives and the work that they've been doing, and I know all of our panelists do. So we're wanting to kind of get into the discussion. This is something that both Steve and I will be posing questions, and we know that the panelists have questions for each other as well. So we're going to try our hand at doing a Zoom discussion, and we're going to cross our fingers that we do it well, or at least we can learn from learn from this experience that we'll take into our second panel, which is focused in on community benefits. So it's a nice complement and it's a nice continuation. And so what I'd like to get back to the discussion that I guess earlier on we were having in terms of how all these tools are being made available to folks. So I guess what I'd like to do is start off with Sarah, and ask Sarah sort of how do we learn more about the framework and where is it made available? And then I'd like to kind of pose the same question to ask Sophie to answer that question, sort of how are your tools being made available? So let's start with Sarah, we'll go to Sophie, and then Moss, hopefully you can answer the same question as to how that will be made available for our participants, because we're going to want to add it into the toolbox, but also those other resources to help folks understand how best to use these tools. So Sarah, can you start us off with that answer?
Sure. Yeah, so the multi-benefit framework is ongoing work, really trying to build out what are the opportunities to look at multiple benefits. So we have a recent report that's on the Pacific Institute website that's meant to be kind of a guidebook or do's and don'ts on looking at multiple benefits, particularly for projects. And it has in there things like, connecting benefits with beneficiaries and ways to bring in stakeholders throughout the process. So that's on the website. And then, and we'll be sharing that as well with kind of the toolbox as it's being developed. So yeah, so everything we have is kind of open access and available, and yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Sophie?
Yes, yeah, thanks for that question. We're in the process of finalizing the analyses. So the water quality component of the work is, we're a couple of days away from feeling like that's finalized. And once that is done, we have a stakeholder outreach process that we're going to go through, where we actually bring a group or groups of people together in a web-based format to share and answer questions about the work that we've done. And eventually we will have everything on our website, which is the website for the California science team of the Nature Conservancy is Science for Conservation. That's FOR conservation.org, scienceforconservation.org. And all of the analyses will be available there. I also invite folks to reach out to me personally if you'd like to learn more. I'm happy to answer any questions. So it's not quite ready for prime time. It's not completely finished, but it will be very soon, and it will be publicly available when it's ready. We also plan to do a peer-reviewed science publication. We'll be submitting that in November, and so that will probably come available, assuming everything goes well, sometime in the 2021 calendar year.
Great, we're going to look forward to that, and I'm sure we'll be following that closely. Moss, how do we learn more about I know we've got Michelle Barton later on today presenting, but in terms of accessing the Biodiversity Index, what's the plan for that for everyone?
Yeah, once it's finalized, and I want to emphasize that word finalized, in the end of October, beginning of November, we'll post it on the LA SAN website. We'll print about 300, maybe 350 hard copies for distribution. Once this is finalized, because this was all done on city time, it'll be a matter of public record once it's finalized, and will be available to anybody that wants it. But we always make presentations. We get a lot of requests for presentations, whether it's neighborhood councils. There's like 99 neighborhood councils within the city of LA. There are landscape designers that have requested our presentations, et cetera, at symposia, like this, that we make presentations. We never say no to a request for presentation because that ends up becoming a snowball effect, and it just gets kind of advertised everywhere. We also we're one of the 100 cities that belong globally that belong to cities with nature. It's almost like a biodiversity Facebook where you can post questions, lessons learned, et cetera, to help other cities, international cities with the biodiversity program. And so we can post it on there, end products. We've already posted the 2018 biodiversity report there. So, and I've actually made presentations at international conferences, the Hotspot Cities Symposium at University of Pennsylvania last year in June, and also in Singapore. During the 10th anniversary of the Singapore Index, I made the presentation for the LA Biodiversity Index. So it's pretty heavily advertised already and available, but once it's finalized, it'll be on all those things that I just mentioned.
Great. Okay, so I know some of the panelists have questions for each other, but I'm going to pass it to Steve, and then we'll come back for some of the other questions that come forward.
Yes, thanks, Eileen. I just have a question maybe for one of the practitioners, maybe Isaac. We got a question from one of the registrants. How do we move forward on the pace we need with green infrastructure when we don't have all the indices, metrics, and monitoring that we might want to have? And maybe, if you can respond to that, and if somebody else has a quick response, that would be fine too.
Well, I think, the monitoring and the indices will help design the projects and monitor them after they're built. But, I think the best way to make change in projects in the project process is really having the right team. You need with biodiversity, especially ecology, water quality, I think it's about having multidisciplinary teams. To get to that triple bottom line, you can't have the traditional linear process with, maybe it's just engineers. You need scientists, you need, ecological designers. That's a key role I think more projects need to have. Someone who speaks the language of science and design. And if you have that right team, you're going to get a better project, I think. So I think that's really a key near-term step is just, maybe we need to look at how we're writing our RFPs, for projects and making sure we have these roles.
Anybody else have any thoughts to respond?
I'd love to jump in too. I think Isaac is absolutely right. Also, I'm bringing in more voices to how we think about green infrastructure, but I also think we could do a better job of looking at kind of the cost or the uncertainty of doing business as usual, that we tend to kind of accept that uncertainty as a given and then put kind of the burden on new projects in green infrastructure to prove that they're valuable rather than also considering in a changing climate, what are our current choices going to do? And I think we could do a better job of kind of articulating that and not saying we need to, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt with all of these metrics for everything that green infrastructure will be better, but that we're kind of weighing that uncertainty for all types of projects.
Sarah, I had a follow-up question for you as well. I thought the idea of a decision-making framework was really interesting and intriguing to me, because in a lot of issues that we try to solve, it's a matter of getting the information, the data, and then developing the way to make a structured decision. So I'll just call it structured decision-making. And I was wondering, in the development of your framework, did you look at how other places might have used something like that to actually make their investments?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of what we were trying to do with the framework was to mimic a relatively straightforward process that most folks go through, and sort of going from project visioning to benefit identification and then quantification. And the idea wasn't to come up with a whole new decision-making process, but really to see where the push points for multiple benefits are in existing decision-making. And so, for example, when we were looking at proposition funding, similar to what Darla was talking about, we were looking at, what is that process from project design through to funding, and how do we provide resources within that decision making? And so I think that kind of gets at your question of, what is the process and how do we interject multiple benefits into it, rather than trying to reinvent how people think about, going from project design through to implementation.
Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Eileen.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions that have come in from our attendees that have kind of fit into this, I guess, and that is, so there's a, oh, I'm sorry, I just lost it. So there's a couple of folks kind of interested in the lessons learned in terms of using a scoring rubric, and the fact that, sometimes it can kind of lead us into unintended consequences. So I guess, Sarah and maybe not so much Sophie, but in terms of like, what do we need to be paying attention to avoid those unintended consequences of applying a framework or an indice in a way that, could lead us down an unintended course. Have you given thought to that, or has that come up in your conversations and how you're developing these frameworks?
I'm happy to start, but I'd love to hear from others on the kind of the more practitioner side, because I think we've done more of the thinking on kind of how to think about it, but then implementation, I'm sure others have a lot of ideas there. A lot of what we've tried to focus on is looking at both benefits and trade-offs in kind of the project design piece, so trying to do that earlier. In general, we tend to talk about multiple benefits as this like rose-colored glasses, everything's really great, there's all these benefits, but early on, if we're able to look at both the benefits and the trade-offs and then weigh those, I think we can help to avoid some of those unintended consequences and potentially then mitigate some of those outcomes through design. And so I think that's been a big way that we've thought about it, is just thinking more proactively early on about the potential consequences of projects.
Yeah. And Sophie, in terms of sort of looking at it from, a couple of different layers there, there are these trade-offs. And so how have you all been looking at the balancing of those trade-offs and where to, locate projects? Oh, you're muted. We need some technical assistance of unmuting Sophie here.
Great, thank you. Could you repeat the end of your question again, Eileen?
Yeah, so there's these trade-offs that Sarah was getting to, and sort of looking at the unintended consequences sometimes of applying a rubric or a framework. And so kind of how do we look at balancing that when we're trying to look at multiple layers and address a number of different priorities going forward, and keeping things in mind in terms of getting those benefits into the project?
Yeah, so one of the things we've tried to do in our planting stormwater solutions work is we've actually separated out siting and project attributes into two separate realms. So I presented here the siting part of the analysis, the actual placement of assuming that these are good projects that provide the values that we'd like them to have. Where would they go? And then the second part, which I did not present, is about thinking about project attributes, because so many other members of the panel talked about what are the things that you would actually want to have in a project that provides benefits. So that is one of the ways that we've dealt with it, is not to try to combine the two at this point in time, just for simplicity's sake. And then I think that there's with any index that's developed, you're going to have kind of this issue of how, when you're assigning scores, how do you weight those scores? Like, what do you consider to be more important? And you can allow the user to weight those scores when you're developing a tool. You can say, oh, well, this user really thinks that public health is important. This user really thinks that biodiversity is important. And this user wants everything to be very important. And so the user can select, and that can help provide a solution that makes sense to that user. I think acknowledging that different folks have different stake in what may happen on the ground, I think is helpful, that there's not one right answer that everyone's going to feel like is the best answer. So I think acknowledging that is helpful. And then finally, I would say having an iterative approach. So once something goes in, being willing to learn from it and and be humble about what we know and what we don't know, and being willing to say, well, okay, here are the things, here's what we can improve,
Right.
both in this project itself and for the projects into the future.
Yeah, and that's a really important lesson to be learned, in that what are we learning along the way, and how are we, where are those opportunities to improve those projects and future projects, certainly. And that depends on that data that we're gathering to inform the next decision-making process. And so I guess I'm gonna wanna kind of take that lead and take it back to our biodiversity index folks. And with Moss and Isaac, I know you've been kind of thinking about, sort of what that iterative process might be in terms of planning and designing for specific species. Moss, I had a question for you, and my question, I'm going to need to get to it, is that you didn't mention the ecosystem services in the biodiversity index. And I'm wondering if you can touch on that, and kind of, because an ecosystem evolves over time, and, those services, have different priorities for different folks. So how is that considered as part of the LA Biodiversity Index?
Yeah, that's actually one, that's a great question. It actually is the major distinction between the Singapore Index, even the revised, updated Singapore Index that will be released pretty soon, and our LA specific biodiversity index, is that the Singapore Index still, the older version and the newer version, still incorporate ecosystem services as metrics for their index. Ours doesn't. Our biodiversity team, with especially with Dr. Isaac Brown leading this effort and discussion on ecosystem services, we purposely left those out. The reason for that is we wanted to keep the LA Biodiversity Index reasonable, 23, 25 metrics. We didn't want 100 to 150 or whatever. It just gets too cumbersome to use. And then no one would use it, which would be self-defeating. The other rationale for not including it is those are really benefits to humans on biodiversity. Carbon sequestration, water infiltration, combating heat island effect, public health, mental health issues. All those things are ecosystem services. And we felt that those were more at the benefit end and not really something to maintain and enhance the biodiversity. So we separated those two. That said, it's not that we don't think that ecosystem services aren't important. In fact, Isaac and I have been talking about developing a separate ecosystem service index that would be associated with the biodiversity index, but that's a little bit further down the road.
Okay, thank you. And just a follow-up, this sort of balancing of or trade-offs is something I know we've kind of discussed internally in a number of different ways. And so I guess I'm gonna want to come back to Darla about sort of how we've looked at those in different ways, or how other municipalities or communities are considering these trade-offs. Can you speak to that? And then I'm going to pass there's a couple more questions that Steve has kind of brought in to the conversation. So after Darla, we'll pass it to Steve. Did I lose Darla? Okay, so we've got Darla on mute. So I think we're gonna, Steve, why don't I pass it to you, and then we can come back and come back to a couple other questions.
Thanks. So I noticed that, in some of the questions we got from people that registered for today, there's this this theme of how do we pay for the maintenance of the green infrastructure once it's in place. And I know that those issues go beyond maybe into some of the other panel discussions we're going to have in the upcoming series, but I think that you all are experts in the area, and you probably got pretty solid ideas of what we need to be considering. And I guess, I would start maybe with Maz, and then maybe if I can get if Darla actually can make things work, I'd like to hear from her, because she works with municipalities. Just get an idea of what your thoughts are with regard to the maintenance of the infrastructure once it's in place.
who's going to start?
I'm asking you to start and maybe Darla to follow up. Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry. Actually, that's not really my area of expertise. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay.
That is more the Watershed Protection Division and Sharon Karagani's group. Certainly, it is a real concern because a lot of the grants and outside funding, straight across the board in science in general, it'll pay for something, but it won't pay for the maintenance, for example. You know, in my career as a marine biologist, they will pay for the crews to collect the animals, but they won't pay to identify the animals once you get back into the lab. And it's the same thing here. They'll pay for the infrastructure, but we have to come up with the funds to do the maintenance from this point forward. And we have that problem with tree planting. We have that problem with green infrastructure, with stormwater. So we just have to do our best to find that money within our departmental budget.
Thank you, Maz. And I certainly understand, you know, the different aspects of a project, getting the science and the monitoring, and then actually going to implementation and how we maintain that. And like I said, I'm sure that's going to be a topic in the future sessions, but I wanted to see if anybody else had any thoughts on it, because you all work with this stuff. You must have opinions about it. And obviously you're not the sole person that's going to make it happen, but I'm interested for the discussion today because it's on the minds of a lot of people that are out there.
Ureli, you want to kind of take a swing at this one, because I know again internally we've had some conversations, but I think even more so with the results of the practitioner study that might kind of help inform this you know, the answer to this question.
Yeah, so it's certainly a gap that the majority of practitioners noted in terms of what they needed to make their project successful. But we did hear from them in terms of like, well, what are some of the strategies that are implementing? And it sort of sounds like there was different levels of success with those strategies, sort of based on the amount of engagement that they had. But, you know, they said making partnerships with city services, for example, with the local community that is near the project, and potentially some of the business leaders. And so I think one of the issues that commonly sort of came up is, you know, there's like rotation in sort of the community members that can attend to a project, and maybe some of the community, some of the business leaders are more responsive to what's right outside their shop and how it makes their shop look. And so there was, you know, a whole slew of successes in terms of how those different partnerships worked out, but that's currently the strategy that folks are using, and definitely identifying that they need additional funding to make sure their projects are successful in the long term. And I think the number one response that we got is, you know, folks are designing these projects to be low maintenance, knowing that that's going to be an obstacle in terms of securing that funding and securing those partnerships for 10, 20 years to make these projects successful for, you know, the life of the project that they're supposed to have.
Thank you, Ureli. I appreciate that. And I want to just try something a little bit different here. I want to open up for one of the panelists that may have a question of another panelist. I'd like to try that and see if we can draw out anything that might be interesting. So I'll just open it up and see if any of you, if you just raise your hand and let us know if you have a question of one of the other panelists. Otherwise, we'll move on. Let's try it out. Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
So I had a follow-up question for Isaac. I love the concept of having umbrella species and this idea that we could monitor for just a couple of species and then be able to understand that means that there's all these other benefits. And I would be curious to hear more about, you know, how you got to that concept and how you picked those four, and whether you see either other species, maybe in other locations that you've seen the same, like a similar type of process, or yeah, and just hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, those four were just kind of chosen because they're the focus of projects. Well, two of them, the Steelhead, we're looking at that for the LA River as a, you know, really driving, you know, potential redesign of the flow patterns in the channel, fish passage, and that's a species. You know, these threatened and endangered species are used all the time to really drive projects. this is kind of looking at it in a different way though. So we've got a list, and we've been working with UCLA and in our expert council on, we've got a long list of potential indicator species, and they all kind of have different purposes, you know. So I think it's interesting. It's a really kind of new idea, and we haven't figured out the right list yet, but I know we want to try to keep it like, ideally we're looking for like 10 species that we could monitor, that would tell us, you know, a really comprehensive, you know, snapshot of the ecosystem, you know, and give us information about, yeah, these really rare places like threatened and endangered species like to hang out, but also the really urban areas, you know, downtown LA, you know, it's not going to be, you know, mountain lions, it's going to be something else. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, and it seems like it's really, you know, kind of the new intriguing one that people are really focusing on. So interested myself just to see where it goes.
I'll turn it back to you, Eileen.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull in a couple of questions from our attendees. This one, so the question is, how do you ensure renters feel the benefits of implementing these improvements? How do you ensure that renters actually accrue the benefits of implementing any of these improvements? They're thinking that property owners definitely have those incentives for rebates, for implementing certain measures, but if they rent out their property, the renter may not necessarily be paying less rent. They may actually be paying more, since the measure implemented can actually be considered an improvement. So it's a pretty, it's a question I think kind of that's interesting for this panel, but I'm wanting to pose it because I think it's one that's going to keep coming up, and we certainly can bring this question into our panel with around community benefits. So anyone want to take a crack at that, a chance at answering that one? I'm giving it some thought myself in terms of, you know, who are we designing these benefits for, right? Again, it comes back to who's in the room and who's not in the room, and who's involved in that design process. And in panel 2, we're going to talk about community benefits and how do we ensure that the community is engaged and educated around these projects. But I think it is relevant to sort of how we're looking at measuring those benefits and the framework and the indices that we're going to use to apply there. Apply to kind of ensure that those benefits are actually accruing to those that, you know, the intended stakeholders, and renters are certainly among the stakeholders, probably in this room, most likely in this room, and, you know, certainly where we're putting these projects in. Any thoughts on that from anyone? Isaac?
Yeah, I've got a thought. I'm not sure if there's a way to raise my hand. I'm just gonna.
That's good.
On the screen, but you know, this is maybe a bit of a stretch, but you know, if you know, renters, you know, that would be benefits that are occurring on their property, right? And so, you know, and others have brought this up, but I think in LA, something like 70% of the land is residential property. And so that's where these renters are living. And you know, most of our infrastructure projects, the projects we've been talking about today, are on, you know, public projects, public rights of way, probably a lot of the times. But how can we kind of refocus and look at that humongous area of land on residential property? And I was really intrigued by Sarah's case study on Austin, how they're, you know, basically payments for ecosystem services on properties. You know, and we've done that here with the water efficient rebate program for landscapes, but is that something that could be expanded and providing more benefits like at that location for those renters? And maybe the landowner is going to reap the benefits of the like, you know, the payment, but something to think about.
Well, and along those lines, sometimes it's the renter that might want to see the improvement happen, that would be willing to actually do the improvement. And so, you know, where do they get the credit, right? Are they, you know, if they're going to be the proponent for a project, maybe in a residential space that they're renting, the owner ends up with that benefit. And so, you know, where are those incentives landing? Are they solely for the owners? Can they include renters that have an owner support? So I kind of put that out there, and I'm seeing that there's this question that's kind of related along the lines of why doesn't LA have a rain garden rebate to supplement the turf removal? It's a good question. It means that, or they're suggesting that Santa Monica has a nice example, and perhaps this could be funded through water quality improvement funding sources. Certainly it's something that we would want to ask of our agencies to consider kind of going forward. I guess I could pose that one back to Steve in a way, maybe. I don't know. Are you up for kind of sharing sort of a perspective on how rebates and incentives come about for different stakeholders?
Sure. I mean, I think that for example, Metropolitan has a program to retrofit devices in multi-family dwellings, and so a lot of the outreach is trying to convey to them the benefits, not only the overall community benefits, but what kind of economic benefits in the long run could evolve for them, and also how they're contributing to the regional efforts to manage supplies and to contribute to ecosystem health. So I think that what we found is, in general, people are wanting to be a part of the solution. They just want to make sure that they have some way of accessing these programs, because if they're removed from being the owner, they sometimes don't feel like they have a direct lever on that. So there's been a lot of effort to try to reach out to entities that can actually get to those parties that don't own, that actually rent, and you know, in cooperation with the owners of those facilities, that program can help move our objectives forward. So I think that is a growing experience. I think that's the one way that we can help contribute towards supporting the effort for water conservation, and even you know, touching the base on the fact that there are disadvantaged communities and renters out there that actually could be a part of the solution and want to be a part of the solution. So that's the response I would give.
Thank you. I think we'll bring this question into the other panels too, because it's not just the only time we can ask this question. We're coming up to around 11 o'clock, and I didn't get a yellow card, so I'm excited that we haven't gotten any yellow cards so far.
Eileen, I have one question before we finish up. I just wanted to ask one of the panelists, can we train citizen scientists to help monitor green infrastructure? This is something that one of the questions that we got from the registrants, and I don't know if Ureli or somebody might be able to address that.
Oh, so this might be more for Sophie, but I know that there are, for projects like Marsh Park, Council for Watershed Health did actually go out with students from the local elementary school, and we did a bio blitz using iNaturalist. And we're able to provide some data in terms of what, you know, Marsh Park, the kinds of species that are being hosted there. And so it does take partnerships with some experts that can identify them sort of in a time that, you know, is satisfying for students to know, you know, what the biodiversity was and what species were identified. But I thought that was a really cool and successful model. And I'm sure some of the other panelists here have more examples of what that might look like.
The answer is definitely yes. It's just a matter of what you want to try and monitor over time. And Ureli provides a great example of how you can use community science or citizen science to monitor biodiversity or to monitor certain taxa or certain species over time. But you could also use it to monitor water quality or urban heat island impact, or all kinds of things. And there are projects that do focus on those things. I think the key would be to find an entity that can steward those efforts. And there are some institutions that have like very well developed community science programs in Greater Los Angeles. So hooking up with them to let them know that these stormwater projects are happening and these can be a focus for that continued effort would be a good idea.
Steve, was your question designing a monitoring program that reflects the efficacy of green infrastructure? Was that your question?
Yeah, so yeah, the question came in from one of the one of the parties that, you know,
Well,
Ken didn't register. And they're just saying, how can we use citizen people that are in the community to help monitor? I think that's the essence of it. So it's a project that's in place, and how do we know how it's working based on, you know, the eyes and ears that are out there?
Right. Well, I'm not going to address it through the community science aspect of it. That is Sophie and you really already touched upon that. But I know that the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, better known as SQUIRT, in Costa Mesa, it's a joint powers agency, and the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition are both working separately, I think, on standardizing methodology on studying the efficacy of BMPs and green infrastructure. So I don't know what the status of that is, but those are in the works.
Thank you, Mas.
Great.
So Eileen, I think we're kind of finished with the Q&A session.
Yeah, unfortunately, because there's now a lot more. I think we kind of like hit our momentum now, just as we're going to need to kind of close, kind of wrap up at this point. And we have more questions, and so we can kind of send those to presenters and give them a chance to answer them, and we can post those up on the website. And we can also bring those into our panel 2 discussion as well. So if you've got more questions, please bring those in. And I'm going to ask that we go to that slide, because we've asked our presenters, and certainly, you know, everybody has shared their ideas for, or I guess what is in their toolbox. You know, what tools and resources are they currently using to better inform sort of the planning and the design, the maintenance, and the community engagement for green infrastructure. And so folks are, I guess up on the slide right now, you can see kind of what's come in. There's a number of different tools. Maintenance manuals seem to be a big, you know, a significant resource. We've had conversations around maintenance manuals. We've developed them, and it's, I think it's a valuable resource. It's just making sure that those are actually being used. So I'm curious, like, how are those maintenance manuals being used, and which ones are sort of the most useful? Would be great. We could have a whole discussion on operations and maintenance, and I'd love to get us there and get us in a room talking about operations and maintenance around green infrastructure. So that will be a topic for future discussion. Right now, I'm going to ask you now, what tools would you like to have? Which tools are you missing? What tools do you need in your green infrastructure toolbox? So we're going to post the, this is another poll. We'd love to kind of see what do we need? What do we need to kind of keep moving things forward? The information is on the slide. You can go ahead and text at the information there, and we'll go ahead and put it in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm not quite sure. I think it's in the chat that it's going to go out. So look there and go ahead and let us know what you're going to need going forward, and those are already coming in. So can you take me to the next slide? And we're going to go into the poster sessions after the break. We have a break between now and 11:05. I think we'll start reconvening around 11:06 since we're a little bit off, and we'll share the results after the poster sessions. At this time, though, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Again, we've got a number of we've had some really great support from LA Department of Water and Power, LA Sanitation and Environment, LA County Public Works, and Jacobs, and the Scotts Miracle-Gro Foundation, and Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They've all contributed to our success over the years, and certainly all of our other sponsoring organizations and companies represented here. We thank them and look forward to partnering and collaborating again. So we're going to, again, take a break right now. We will, I guess, kind of reconvene here at 11:05, and we'll introduce our poster session. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists. We're going to have them back as part of the closing, but thank you, each of you. It's really great to see your work, and we're looking forward to following in the coming years. All right, we'll see you back here in, let's go to 11:06, a couple more minutes. Thanks.
James and Michelle, can you start your video? I just want to make sure that we have you on the panel. Great. Thanks, Michelle. Morning, guys. Perfect. Feel free to leave it running or turn it off until it's your turn. Either way works for us.
Drew, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay. I had obviously a little technical difficulty there.
Yeah, sorry about that, Darla.
No, I don't know what happened. And I tried to change my space, hence my change in background scenery, but dang, I missed out. I wanted to ask people stuff too, but that'll be a follow-up. But I wanted to test now that I'm working, so I seem to be good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Darla. Sorry, appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no problem.
Jen, Michelle, James, you want to check your mics real quick? I think I heard maybe from, no, oh, good. I'm glad we checked the mics. I'm going to make you co-hosts so that you can mute and unmute yourselves.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sorry.
I think, yeah, I might have lost connectivity a couple of times, so I don't know if that affected the mute and unmute.
Looks like it's working again.
Yeah, and I think I'm set up now too. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Yep, looks good. Am I coming through?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Thank you.
And then Drew, just let me know when you'd like me to switch over to my screen.
Will do.
Hi, Jen. Hi, James. Hi, Michelle. This is Eileen.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. I'm going to give folks maybe just another minute just to kind of get back settled. So there'll be quick introductions because the program has a lot of information about your presentation. So I'll start with you, Jen, and then on our end, we'll transfer the screen sharing to you.
Perfect, thank you.
And I think we'll just ask the panelists from the first session to stop their video. By doing so, we'll be able to keep just the 3 poster presenters up as panelists.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so we're going to, I think we can go ahead and start now. All right, well, welcome back everyone. We have a poster session that we're excited to share with you. We've got 3 posters for this panel session, and we've got other posters lined up for the next panel. So again, we're recording, and if you have to step away or you miss out on one of these, you can always go back and revisit. So today we have Jennifer Swart with the Water Replenishment District. She'll be presenting on Built for Sustainability. We also have Michelle Barton with the City of Los Angeles, LA Sanitation and Environment, who will be presenting on this City of LA's Biodiversity Index, giving us a little bit of a deeper dive, which is exciting that we have that opportunity to learn more. And then we will close with James Powell with Alta Planning and Design, who will present on Merced Avenue Greenway, a multi-benefit project. So we'll start with Jen. And Jen, are you ready to begin?
Yes, good morning everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just going to navigate to share my screen. And maybe Eileen, you can let me know that you're able to see this.
Yep, you're looking good.
Wonderful. So great to be here today. My name's Jen Swart. I'm with the Water Replenishment District in our Public Affairs Department. And so today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about WRD and then introducing our latest facility. And so here we're just going to be using the story map to go through this. So the Water Replenishment District is a groundwater management agency that was formed by a vote of the people in 1959 to manage and protect 2 of the most utilized urban groundwater basins in the nation. So that's the West Coast Basin pictured here in blue, and the central basin in green. And so groundwater from these two basins provides 50% of the total water supply for 4 million people within the WRD service area. And that encompasses 43 cities in southern LA County. So today we're going to be visiting virtually a facility, a water treatment facility here in the Montebello Forebay in the city of Pico Rivera. And this is our newest facility, opened up in 2019. It's the Albert Robles Center for Water Recycling and Environmental Learning. And so this is an advanced water treatment facility that was constructed with for the purpose of groundwater replenishment, meaning that water treated here is used to replenish our groundwater aquifers in those two basins that were pictured before. And so ARC is the cornerstone of our Water Independence Now program, or our WIN program. And this means that with the completion of this project, WRD has the capacity to have a fully locally sustainable supply for groundwater replenishment. And so we use stormwater and recycled water for that purpose, and that has actually reduced the regional strain on imported water supplies. So we're very happy to have this project up and running. So you can see here, the project site is on a 5-acre lot in the city of Pico Rivera, and it's actually sitting along the banks of the San Gabriel River. And so the project site is divided into 3 different components. Here on the right, we've got the large building, that's the Advanced Water Treatment Facility. And this treats 14 million gallons of water per day using ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, and UV light for disinfection, which is just out of sight on this photo. And so the other aspects of the facility are actually our sustainable and green infrastructure features that are sprinkled throughout the site, and that have actually earned the project site the distinction of becoming LEED Platinum certified. And so that's kind of what we're going to dive into today. And then thirdly, we've got our environmental learning center, and that's in this building right here. And that actually houses a 2,000 square foot digital exhibit space with 40 exhibits that are focused on recycled water, groundwater, and water conservation. So unfortunately today with our time, we don't have time to go into the learning center and nor into the treatment facility, but rather we'll be focusing on the sustainability features of the project. And so here I'm going to start off actually with our biggest feature, which is our integrated stormwater management system. And so the site was designed to capture 11,000 cubic feet of stormwater. And that represents a 0.95 inch rainstorm in a 24-hour period. And so at the heart of this system is our stormwater treatment and infiltration system. So a lot of the site drains to this southeastern corner here, and it's actually diverted into this unit here. We're missing the top unit, which is a hydrodynamic separator, which actually takes the stormwater inflows and separates out debris and trash, and also the hydrocarbons and any oils that might settle to the bottom of the unit. And then the treated stormwater can actually travel into these large corrugated pipes. So these are 8 feet tall, they're 36 feet long, and then they're perforated so that any of the clean stormwater has time to kind of slowly infiltrate into the substrate below. So because the site is right on the San Gabriel River, the native soils below are very sandy, and so they can just percolate into those native soils below. Another piece of and this system was designed to capture 9,000 cubic feet of stormwater. So the remaining 2,000 cubic feet are captured in different components. So here I'll highlight that we've got 130 parking stalls that line the property, that are poured with porous concrete and lined with permeable pavers. And so again, this allows stormwater to percolate right down below, water that falls on this area or that's directed there through grading. And then if there's any overflow from these areas or any site grading that might bring water over into the perimeter of the site, the perimeter is actually lined with 5 different biofiltration basins or bioswales. And so these are areas that are landscaped with California native vegetation. And again, that acts as a pooling area and an infiltration area for stormwater to enter. And then lastly, we've got, as a part of the integrated stormwater management system, we've got our green roof. So this is a very exciting area of the facility where we've got lightweight soil and drought tolerant species planted up here. And that acts as another point of capture. And actually, it's kind of cool, any overflow that comes from the roof that's not captured here directly is actually directed to planters on the ground floor. And then, so just briefly, I'll also introduce that we have demonstration gardens. We received a $1 million grant from the Rivers and Mountains Conservancy for California native and drought tolerant demonstration gardens. So we're very excited to have a pollinator garden and show a lot of different species that folks can maybe use even in their homes. And the entire landscaped area is irrigated with a low flow drip irrigation that uses reclaimed water. And then if we pop over to the electric side, so you'll notice here that the treatment facility is covered with 995 solar panels, and this generates enough electricity to power the learning center. So we're really excited about that feature as well. And then lastly, this is just a point for education. And so this isn't necessarily a sustainability feature, but the site also features a 250-foot-long working model of the San Gabriel River. And this actually has a working rubber dam that we can inflate and deflate. When we inflate it, it shows that water can be diverted from the San Gabriel River over into the spreading basins. And so this site is very exciting because the primary purpose of it is for advanced water treatment, but the secondary purpose really is for education. So we hope that someday everyone can come and visit in person. And so with that, I'll pass it off. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it off. Thank you.
Jen. Thanks, Jen. That model is amazing. Can you share the hours and the days and the hours that folks can visit? I don't know if you're open now, or I know we'll get the link for the map, the story map, so that everybody can access the virtual tour. But if the facility is open, it'd be great to provide that link too. I'm sure people can find it on the website. Are you open at this point?
So unfortunately, right now we're not open to the public, and even we had just opened up the education piece in January, and we were inviting field trips to come by. So, but at that, for those are for appointment only at this time.
Okay.
So until we kind of ramp up and get all our staffing going and everything, it's going to be by appointment only. So please feel free to share my contact information, and we're happy to plan tours. Just like Ma said, we never turn a tour request down.
Great. Thank you. So next is Michelle Barton with LA Sanitation and Environment. So Michelle, are you ready to take us on a deeper dive of the LA City Biodiversity Index?
Yes, I'm ready as soon as I can get my slides up.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Barton, and I'm an environmental specialist with LACN and Environment. And today I'm going to be giving a little bit of a deeper dive into the LA City Biodiversity Index and building on what Moss and Isaac have already presented today. Next slide, please. So again, just some brief background on our program. As Moss mentioned earlier, our program really originated in 2017 with the Biodiversity Council motion passed by Councilmember Paul Koretz. And that motion directed LACN to create a customized biodiversity index for the city of LA that would help measure meaningful progress on biodiversity goals. So in order to go about that, we established an internal biodiversity team, as well as pooled together experts from the region to create what we called our Biodiversity Expert Council. And we leveraged their expertise to measure an existing biodiversity index, the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. And the results of that process are published in our 2018 biodiversity report. That report is available at our webpage, lacdcn.org/biodiversity, which is at the bottom of this slide. And that report contains both the score from the Singapore Index, which was 48 out of 72 points, but most importantly, it contained recommendations for how to move forward with this customized biodiversity index. Next slide. So as Mas alluded to earlier, we actually had a lot of value in this Singapore Index measurement process. And based on input from the Biodiversity Expert Council, we actually decided that we wanted to retain a lot of the metrics that it included. There was immense value in those things. Other metrics didn't really fit the LA environment or just had kind of funny measurement scales, and so we modified those metrics. But then we also added in a number of new metrics that really would help measure things that were either specific to the LA context or were somehow missing from the Singapore Index. So the resulting draft LA Biodiversity Index is shown in the table on the right. And I've colored mine a little differently than Mas did to show the hierarchical structure of this index. So we have 3 overarching themes shown in green, and then we have more specific indicators shown in blue, and then quantifiable metrics shown in purple. And the major themes are native species protection and enhancement, and this is where we look at % natural areas, habitat quality, connectivity, and those indicator species that Isaac was talking about. Then there are social considerations where we're looking at access to biodiversity, education, and just kind of equity. And then lastly, governance and management, where we're looking at kind of departmental activities that have to do with biodiversity. Next slide. So in order to go about actually measuring the index, we're going to have 2 types of assessments. We're going to have benchmark assessments, which are done every 10 years, and these will be very technical, detailed assessments. In between these big benchmark assessments, we're going to have monitoring assessments, and these will be a little less data intensive and happen every 3 years. And for both of these assessments, each of the 23 metrics will be distilled to an easily interpretable score. For the benchmark years, this will be a numeric score, and then for the monitoring years, we'll be using ordinal values, and so there'll be kind of positive and negative assessments on each metric. We're also going to have a single graphic or map for most of our metrics, and there will be an example of that on my next slide. But I did really just want to touch upon the fact that we're going to be using some cool graphics to track the performance of our entire index. So the pie charts you see here are how we're proposing to go about this. And the shading or coloration is how we're looking at performance. So for the benchmark assessments, darker green pie slices indicate that that metric has a higher score. And then for the monitoring years, which again are kind of looking at negative or positive trends for individual metrics, the darker blue scores indicate the kind of best progress on those metrics. The other thing I did want to touch upon briefly, and both Isaac and Mas included some allusions to this in their presentations, is that we're going to be looking at our metrics within individual ecotope units. And there's a little graphic in the bottom right-hand corner that shows the basic outlines of these smaller management units in Los Angeles. But if you can click to bring in my next graphic, as Mas showed earlier, we really feel that by looking at metrics within these individual ecotopes, we'll be able to more clearly present to the public kind of what's going on with these metrics and where the disparities are. So we can really start to compare individual ecotopes and then tailor actions within those ecotopes to improve conditions. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, We are hoping to publish our 2020 biodiversity report later this fall, and that will include the final version of our LA City Biodiversity Index, as well as the ecotopes framework. And we're hoping that other municipalities can use this as a model to really kind of develop indices for their own areas. We're also really hopeful that we can integrate our efforts with LA County, both in terms of the index and the ecotopes framework, so that our efforts are more regional and integrated. Once we wrap up our 2020 biodiversity report, our team's main focus will be to complete the first measurement of the LA index. And this process is already underway. We've done a lot of preliminary measurements, and you can see a map on the right that shows some preliminary results for one of our indicators, 2.3a, on community science app utilization. But once all of our metrics have been assessed, we'll really understand the baseline and be able to kind of think of how we can take action, make policy recommendations to not only move our individual metrics scores forward, but really propel biodiversity protection and enhancement across the city. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle. We have a lot more to learn, I know, as the years go on and as you kind of develop out more of the details. Certainly the index will be a valuable tool for the planning of any of our projects, and James Powell with Alta Planning and Design is going to share with us one project that has recently been is completed design and is now kind of looking forward to implementation. So James, are you ready to share with us about the Merced Avenue Greenway?
Ready to go.
Great. Okay, it's in.
Okay, thank you. I'm James Powell. I'm a landscape architect with Alta Planning and Design, and I'll be speaking about the Merced Ave Greenway. This project was, the design portion of the project was funded by a grant from the Coastal Conservancy that the Council for Watershed Health helped prepare for the city of South El Monte. This project, it was a huge team effort. The council brought together a great team. It included active SGV who were local to the area to do outreach, Climate Resolve to work on urban heat reduction, Tetra Tech for civil engineering and the stormwater BMP design, and Alta for the bikeway design and the landscape. You can go to that next slide now, please. Thank you. So the project is on a north-south corridor that in its entirety covers all of South El Monte from its northern to southern city limits. The portion that we just finished designing is about 3/4 of a mile long and covers the southern half of the project. It's primarily residential. The northern half of the project is a little bit more of an industrial land use. And the street is generally about 66 feet wide, the pavement of the street itself. It had 2 travel lanes in each direction. You know, it's a 4-lane road, fairly typical kind of collector street for the area. And from its outset, the project was really designed to be multi-benefit. So we were looking at ways to capture water, protect public safety, and help reduce heat out there. The area was currently experiencing flooding when it rained, had pretty bad water quality due to some of those industrial land uses and some of the runoff from those sites. Regarding public safety, there was no bike facility there yet. You can see that middle top image. You can see where there are donuts in the intersections there. There's a lot of speeding on this road. And heat reduction, the street really had very few street trees to begin with, and with such a wide street, it's just a lot of asphalt out there soaking up and building up a lot of heat throughout the day. So we started looking at some preliminary strategies, how we can start using some of that wide roadway to help save some of these, serve some of these challenges. So where can we capture water? How can we get a bikeway facility integrated? How can we make it more pleasant for pedestrians to walk out there too? And how can we get some more trees out there? Next slide, please. So a huge portion of this project was just connecting with the community out there. We wanted this project to be one that really helped serve the needs that the community helped us identify. And we wanted it to be well accepted by the community once it started getting built. We wanted it to be something that really helped them. So one thing we did was working with Active SGV, we put together a demonstration event. One of our outreach events was right there in the neighborhood. There was basically a patch of grass in front of one of the industrial sites out there, and we took that over for an afternoon. We set up a demonstration of what a cycle track would be like out there with the planted separation from traffic. We had a food vendor, we set up tables, we had some giveaways, and we had surveys for folks to fill out. And it was great. You know, people hung out all day. They stayed as long as we were open. Kids were out there trying it. The former mayor was out there trying it out, and you know, people were really getting into it. And it was a great opportunity for us to share what these different benefits of the project would be. The other portions of the outreach that we conducted, we went door to door, up and down the corridor, speaking with basically every resident out there. We attended community events. We had more traditional workshops as well. And really overall, the response from the community was highly positive. People were concerned about losing street parking, which is something we didn't have to do as part of the design here. We managed to keep the street parking in place. And other than that, folks were just really excited about making this street a better place. People were really concerned about the safety of walking and biking out on the street and the high traffic speeds, and they've been experiencing the heat themselves. Next slide, please. As part of that outreach, we brought 3 main alternatives to the community, and 2 of them involved the protected bikeway. We looked at them as both one-way and two-way, using both sides of the street or focusing it all on one side of the street, having it elevated up at sidewalk level or down at street level. And then we also looked at what would happen if we didn't reconfigure the roadway, if we left the lanes as they were, and what could we do in each of those scenarios to address the different concerns that we had for the project. And in the end, the community support for an elevated facility at sidewalk level adjacent to the sidewalk was really pretty overwhelming. And folks were really excited about getting more landscape out there, as well as having that protected facility. Next slide, please. So the final design we ended up with was, as I said, it was a elevated bikeway. It's at sidewalk level. In different parts of the project, it's either integrally colored to separate it from pedestrian traffic. So in those areas, which is the photo on the right here, or the rendering on the right, shows how we've essentially created a pathway up and down this street, completely separated from traffic. In some other areas, we have landscapes separating the bikeway from pedestrians as well. We've got, we ended up taking the 4-lane roadway and taking that down to 2 lanes, putting in a center turn lane. The traffic volumes on the street allowed that without any significant impacts to traffic on the road or creating additional delay out there. This all allowed us to create landscape parkways all up and down the corridor as well. And all of those parkways are able to capture stormwater, not only from the street, but also from the larger watershed that feeds into the street. Those parkways were landscaped with native vegetation. The parking lanes on the street, where we did keep the street parking, we added permeable interlocking pavers in those areas so that where the curb had traditionally been on the street, we did still have a curb, but the gutter, essentially we created a permeable gutter where the water from the street itself was just flowing straight into that. We also included structural tree vaults under the new street trees. What these allow is the trees themselves to have a much greater volume of soil to expand roots into, and also allows the trees themselves to share that soil volume between trees. And fortunately as well, the project had a recycled water line running right through the northern end of it that the city had used for a few of their municipal landscapes. We were able to tap into that. So all of this new landscape could stay irrigated, could stay healthy. but would also be irrigated with that recycled water. Next slide. And so in the end, we ended up with, on this three-quarter mile stretch of roadway, we have 133 new street trees. Many of them are in those tree wells that I mentioned. The tree species themselves, we really wanted to emphasize native species as much as we could, but we also mixed in a few other climate appropriate species. And the rationale for that was really the shot-hole borer more than anything else. There's a lot of that in this local area. And we wanted to make sure that if a tree did get infected, it wouldn't wipe out the whole roadway. We wanted to make sure that there was enough diversity in the tree species that they would be resilient. We ended up with about 20,000 square feet of new landscape area with the recycled water irrigation, as I mentioned, also with an emphasis on locally native species. We took a look at really what was growing here before this area was even developed and tried to bring some of those species back. We've got the protected bikeway, the cycle track running all the way up and down each side of the street through here. And then we've got the stormwater BMPs that are running not only in the parking aisle, as I mentioned, but also under a lot of the landscape areas. Those are using our tank technologies in a lot of areas to increase the amount of stormwater volume they can capture. And Tetra Tech will actually be back next month for the second panel as part of this symposium. And they'll be really focused on the details of the stormwater portion of the project. So the project is set to begin construction next year. It's received funding for construction from the California Natural Resources Agency as part of Prop 68. And we're hoping to be able to open it up in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thanks, Michelle and Jen. Those are great presentations and good examples of what we're looking at and what we're learning from green infrastructure. And we do have more panel presentation or more poster presentations in panel 2. So I encourage you to register for that if you haven't. We are in a really nice position that we have some extra time. We are a little bit ahead of where we thought we would be. And so I'm wanting to kind of come back to that Q&A where we and bring back our panelists and incorporate our poster presenters for a few more questions from our, either amongst yourselves, or I'd like to bring in a few from our attendees. So can we get all of our, I'm not sure who I'm asking this of, I think it's kind of on our back end. Make sure that everybody has their microphone on. Yep.
We just need the former panelists to start their video and they'll show up here.
Great.
We did want to set aside a few minutes for questions of the poster presenter, so maybe we could start there.
Yep. And so do we, and I'm going to encourage our attendees to send in questions for the poster presenters through the Q&A. And let's see if we can get to those here. So do I have questions for the poster session, folks? Sorry, I'm finding the technical, let's see. Okay,
at this time, we were going to ask attendees to raise their hand, and we would actually call on them and unmute.
Okay.
There are 2 hands raised. We can see if those were questions from earlier or for the poster presenters. But if you do have questions regarding the posters, please raise your hand. And we'll start with Sandra Cattell. I'm unmuting your mic. Sandra, are you there?
Her mic is not unmuted.
There she is.
Hello. I have a question about the bike path streets we just looked at and the tree vaults. I'm wondering if they're anticipating any problems with the tree roots causing problems with either the streets or the bike path.
Thank you for your question. Well, what we installed in addition to those tree vaults, we also have root barriers where the trees are adjacent to hardscape, which essentially pushes the tree roots downward. So it's not a hard barrier, forever, more or less, but it keeps the tree roots from growing too close to the surface. And then what we also have is with these tree vaults, they actually improve the situation that you would normally have with tree roots breaking up either sidewalks or roadway at the surface by giving those trees more soil volume that's much less compacted to grow into beneath the surface. So, so essentially it's the two stages there. The root barrier will force the roots from growing too close to the surface in the first place, but then the tree vaults will allow the trees to essentially discourage the trees from roaming towards the surface to look for more water. They'll have healthier soils to grow into at a deeper depth.
Thank you.
And I'm unmuting Leslie Pertel. Leslie, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
We can.
I just wondered what would be some examples of particularly the native trees in the last project that was presented.
Yes. Well, we included an Engelmann oak. That was one that was particularly local. We also had the California sycamore, we had a desert willow. We had an island live oak, which is closer, but a little bit different. And then from that, we sort of spread out into a couple of acacia species as the more sort of shot hole resilient species, and also included an African sumac, which would also be a bit more resilient. If we didn't have a shuttle borer to contend with, we would have loved to have had Engelmann oaks running all the way up and down.
And what was that? If you didn't have a shuttle?
Oh, shot hole borer. Sorry.
The shot hole borer. Okay.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. And one more question. I think this is our last hand raised from Nick Garrity. Nick, are you there? You may need to unmute yourself. Doesn't look like Nick is there. Eileen, so we can move on to additional questions. You're muted, Eileen. There you are.
Okay. It looks like Nick is still muted from where I'm standing.
Yeah, we've given him the permissions to unmute. So we can try it one more time.
And we do have another hand raised.
Nick, are you there? Okay, looks like his hand went down. So it looks like Deborah is there. I'm going to unmute Deborah. Deborah, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you for taking my question. This is a general question to proposers of, sorry about the dogs, I didn't really want to do it this way. I was hoping you could just read my question. To all proposers of the, I'm going to read it for you. Actually, to avoid the dog barking, could you read it for me, Drew, and then I will mute myself so you don't have to hear the dogs barking?
Sure. Is it in the Q&A?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A. I was just going to. Thank you.
Sure. And Eileen, if you see it, chime in. I'm looking for it now. Hate to use the time like this. Eileen, why don't you move on and we'll, when I find it, we'll ask it.
Well, actually, I was waiting for you to ask it, but I've got Deborah. So to all the proposers of the BMPs and street right-of-ways, what is your assessment of the importance of stormwater or recycled water, the importance of stormwater storage for meeting your water conservation and water quality goals at a scale? If storage is important, how do you address this at the design storm or 85th percentile scale?
I'm not sure I'm necessarily going to be addressing the question. And when Tetra Tech comes on to discuss the technologies more specifically next month, they'll probably do a better job than I will, but I'll do my best for them here. And in the case here, we really emphasized essentially expanding the watershed of any water that may have ended up on the street here, making sure that we were capturing at least that 85th percentile storm. And a large part of how that tied into water quality itself was making sure that a lot of the runoff from these industrial properties was getting captured before it entered the storm drain system at all. So part of our goal here for the 85th percentile and beyond was capturing that water in the tanks underground and making sure that that water was allowed to percolate before overflowing into any storm drain systems. And really specifically into Leg Lake, which is just south of this project area and in Whittier Narrows. So it was really trying to keep more or less any of the water that was hitting the street, letting that hit the ground and percolate rather than running straight through the storm drain system into the lake.
That's the last raised hand, Eileen.
Yeah, Eileen, do you want to take a couple of those questions that are in the Q&A?
Yeah.
In the posters.
Drew, do we have those? I mean, are we okay to, let's just go ahead and go with one of them. So we've got a Q&A here. And this may have come in, well, anyways, let me just go ahead and ask this one. So this is for stormwater. Heat island and biodiversity goals. How do we marry CAL FIRE's requirements in California law that states that a home or other structure's defensible space requires no trees within 100 feet? Does this mean many homes cannot have trees, assuming this would also apply for commercial and industrial defensible space and trees? So this is kind of an interesting question related to the biodiversity challenge and kind of thinking about where we place projects. So I guess this is maybe beyond, or maybe it's part of the poster sessions, but anybody else on the panel want to answer the question? Maybe Sophie?
Yeah, I was, don't have a deep familiarity with defensible space, but just in reading that question, went and looked at the website, and I don't think it's a exclusion of all trees. I think it's about maintenance of the trees and maintenance of the relationship between trees, shrubs, and grasses within Zone 1, which is the zone immediately surrounding a house. So I think that there are ways to meet multiple objectives and still use native vegetation. And there's some good examples on the CAL FIRE website for native vegetation, different types of plants that can be planted that meet those goals of providing a fire-safe landscape. So I think it's about threading the needle and also determining where fire risk is greater. And a lot of places in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, are places where we think about there being potentially greater wildfire risk. Of course, a fire can happen anywhere, but thinking about how to use landscaping and how to use vegetation in a stormwater project is going to be, the location of that project is going to be paramount for determining how much of a fire risk is presented. And so I'll pause there.
Michelle, you are part of, or were part of the tree planting group within LA San and dealt quite a bit with CAL FIRE and CAL FIRE grants. Do you have a response for that?
Yeah, so one thing I'll point out for anyone who doesn't know is that CAL FIRE is actually the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And so they do deal directly with forestry issues, as well as Sophie pointed out, they have guidance on all sorts of issues. But, you know, the idea of planting trees and conflicts with infrastructure doesn't just end with this idea of defensible space. When we're planting in public spaces across the city, there are other issues that come up. And so there's always this game of trying to find appropriate places and opportunities. And maybe this is where the Nature Conservancy's opportunity map comes into play. But there are other things besides defensible space. There are rail lines, there are street lights, other infrastructure that we need to plan around. And so I think that needs to be integrated into overarching plans and ideas for expanding biodiversity.
I would also add that Sophie basically hit it right on the head with talking about the wildland urban interface, and that's where that defensible space is most important. And that's where you would really want to be following those defensible space guidelines in areas that have been determined to be most susceptible to wildfire. So somewhere, for better or worse, somewhere like South El Monte, where we were showing the Merced Ave Greenway, is somewhere that is really not prone to wildfire. That by the time a wildfire might reach South El Monte, I think our tree selection wouldn't have much to do with it. We'd have an entire county on fire. But that's where those guidelines become most applicable, is these communities up in the foothills and in the mountains and areas that are really more prone to burning in the first place.
I would like to add to what was just mentioned by Michelle. There's the siting of trees and the technical siting of where you can place trees and all the constraints. That always seems to be more constraints than opportunities. But also there's the maintenance and funding angle of where we place trees. So in many communities, especially underserved communities, we'll see the trees being placed within the private property parcel because the assumption that the resident is going to take care of that tree because the funding isn't available by that public agency to take care of the tree when it's placed in the public right of way. But what we often see in communities is where those trees are cut down or they're not taken care of, et cetera. So there's also this funding dynamic that goes with the placement of the trees that is really a huge limitation for many, many communities in being able to implement trees as part of one of the most simplest elements of green infrastructure that we can possibly have.
Just one more addition to this discussion is that if we can't plant trees, our native shrubs are really a big part of the endemic biodiversity of the LA region, especially the coastal sage scrub, the soft chaparral, the lower shrubs, incredibly diverse. That's what all the butterflies are into. So if you can't plant trees, think about that. And it turns out a lot of the soft chaparral, isn't as fire prone as the chaparral because it doesn't have as much, lignin and year-round leaves. So on the CAL FIRE list, some of our great native shrubs are actually okay in that zone 1. So if you can't plant trees or bigger vegetation, think about shrubs. Also, native wildflowers, perennial grasses. There's a ton of biodiversity, without trees.
I think that's a great point, Isaac. When I was in Singapore for the 10th anniversary of the Singapore Index, we were driving around and the lead person for the Singapore Index, Dr. Lenny Chang, was talking. We were taking a bus ride to the Botanic Gardens, and she was talking about the multi-layer of vegetation, ground cover, small shrubs, medium shrubs, large shrubs, trees, and then all this vegetation that was crawling up hotel buildings and condominiums and apartments. Everybody on their balcony had potted plants and stuff. And it just went all the way up for like 20 or 30 feet. It was amazing. So I'm glad you brought that up, Isaac, because it's not all about trees. It's about other vegetation as well.
I think we're at a good kind of point to kind of bring things to a close. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of sharing of information. I'm wanting to see if we've got our tool, and there's many tools that has been shared, and I'd like to thank everybody who has shared a resource, that has shared a link. We'll be sharing the tools that have been available that we know exist currently. But you also gave us some ideas of what additional tools you need in that toolbox. And so that's coming through loud and clear on this slide here. So we'll be looking at how we address this lack of tools, and maybe for someone it's a tool that they don't know exists, and then we'll maybe kind of match up with maybe some resources that do exist to help fill folks' toolbox. And we'll direct you to our website on that one in the follow-up. Sorry, I just realized I didn't have that. So we'd like to thank our presenters, and I'm going to pass it to Steve to provide some closing thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you in the next panels. So Steve, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Eileen. And yeah, actually, I wanted to offer some thoughts. It's not necessarily, the conclusion, thoughts of the day, but it's just a perspective. I think that a lot of good discussion today. We had Ureli, I think for me, identified that, educational benefits was kind of something that popped out. And so we took notice of that. And a lot of times the data that's collected is not consistently lined up with the benefits, or maybe in some cases not at all. Then we had Sarah from Pacific Institute that argued that there's a better approach to addressing multi-benefits and how that process can work, what kind of framework, and the idea of stacking rebates. I thought that was interesting and important. And then we had Sophie from the Nature Conservancy that talked about using indicators to focus on the areas that provide the greatest benefit, because that's what we're looking to do, is to provide the best overall value and to include social and public health, which I think is very important, particularly today. And then Maz for the City of LA talked about their effort on biodiversity and just all of that work that's gone on since 2017 to define that, and it's coming to conclusion in this year. So that's really promising. That will help inform our investments in the city's efforts. And then Isaac, who I think really pointed out the importance of connectivity and making sure that all of the pieces kind of fit together. And Darla with their Proposition 1 experience, and the fact that it's more than just ordinances or regulations, but also programs, capital programs, and voluntary rebate programs that can come into the mix in terms of serving the overall needs and the investments that we're talking about here. And the poster sessions were real good examples of projects and efforts moving forward. We got more detail on the Biodiversity Index. We got a glimpse at the Water Replenishment District project and the Merced Avenue Greenway. So that's a good way of understanding the actual in-the-ground projects and the on-the-ground programs within the City of LA. Overall, I would say that we're looking to develop projects that are based on good data, good information, science, and that includes human science and community needs as well. And I think all of that provides for a framework to inform good decision-making and good investment, because I think we're looking to utilize the funding that's available in different ways for multiple benefits, not for single benefits. And I think that really does tie into the next session, where we're going to talk about community engagement and program implementation. I would like to thank the sponsor. Can you go back? I'd like to thank the sponsors and supporters, partners, and I would like to thank the LA Department of Water and Power, the LA Sanitation and Environment, LA County Public Works, Jacobs, the Scotts Miracle-Gro Foundation, Metropolitan Water District, and all of the other sponsoring organizations and companies. And hopefully you saw this as I was speaking, and maybe looking at it to recognize all of those parties that are truly invested in what we're trying to do. We have a couple of segments coming up. Do we have okay, October 15th and October 29th. I don't know if the next slide shows that. Yeah, October 15th and October 29th. So that's panel 2 and panel 3. On October 15th, we'll be talking about how the community engagement can work, because that's definitely important. And County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl will be providing a keynote address on that. She's so experienced in the water issues over the many years. And then on the next session, we've got Secretary Wade Crowfoot for California Natural Resources. And we're also talking about integration and how do we make sure that all of the various programs at the state level, the regional level, the local level, they work together so that we all benefit from it. We all benefit from very sound investments and projects that deliver the benefits that people are looking for. I would like to thank the panel members today. You did a great job. I think it was very interactive. We tried to get to as many questions as possible, but like we said, we will take all of the remaining questions and address those, and that will be posted on the website. You can go to watershedhealth.org. And also, you might even stay in contact with us if you have any feedback regarding the program. And I'd like to thank Eileen and her staff for organizing all of the logistics here and all of the programs and the speakers. And again, thank you to our sponsors. And I really look forward to the next session on October 15th. And for all of you that are not direct participants, but you were listening in today, I hope that you gained an understanding of where things are, and the council is interested in bringing parties together so that we can move things forward. We can move forward solutions in a collaborative way, and that's what we're striving for. So we're looking to do that similarly on October 15th and October 29th. And I thank you very much and hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.